Uh, thing number four, Gary. We talked about it earlier. Again, this is the central bankers are delusional issue. The European Central Bank cuts rates, warns of more inflation. Again, we'd send them an irony meter. You said if it wasn't already broken by the Fed. Thing number four, Gary. ECB's rate cut, desperation and confusion unveiled.
So, Rob, I asked you earlier, if Kashkari's comments on Bitcoin, when he says there are infinite supply of dollars, but somehow it's Bitcoin that's worth zero. And I said, hey, is that the dumbest thing you've heard by a central banker this week? Well, guess what? We have Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, said, hold my beer, because here I come. Right. This
Hold
is
my beer. Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Exactly. By the way, one of my favorite follows on X is Rudy Havenstein, the pseudonym for somebody who, like me, is very skeptical of central bankers. And, every few months he does something showing a picture of Christine Lagarde, suggesting that she does not cast a shadow or a reflection in the mirror. I think he believes she's a vampire. I just want to be clear. Deep Knowledge Investing has no proof at all that Christine Lagarde is a vampire. And we are not accusing Christine Lagarde of being a vampire. I just want to be clear. We are in no way suggesting that Christine Lagarde is a vampire. So that those words are out there, and now we've covered that. Anyway, so last week, the ECB lowered their interest rate, their version of the Fed funds rate, by 25 basis points. That's 0.25%, dropping that rate from 3.5% to 3.25%. And at the same time, she issued a warning, which was inflation is expected to rise in the coming months. Now, think that through for a minute. Why does she do this? Right. So if you have inflation and you're a central banker, the prescription is you raise interest rates. If you are worried about a bad economy and you feel like you have inflation under control, you would lower interest rates. So lowering interest rates is an inflationary move. So she reduced their version of the Fed funds rate and then said inflation is going to rise. But if inflation is rising, why in the world would you lower rates? That creates more inflation. That's the problem that the central banks are supposedly trying to solve. So you can either assume that she's dumb and engaging in bad policy, and I would not believe that one, or you have to assume that they're not dumb and trying to do something else. And between the two of us, Rob, I would bet on number two every time.
So, Gary, tell us more about what number two means, and then how closely, too, does this align with what we're seeing over at the Bank of Japan, which obviously you've written about extensively, called very early on in terms of the fall of the yen, in terms of purchasing power.
We think there are two issues, right? So, like Japan, like the UK, like the United States, the EU, the European Union, has too much debt. And so they're stuck between two impossible choices. One is more inflation, right? Lower interest rates, which is what they did. You get more inflation, or alternatively, higher interest expense, right? Because if you raise interest rates, that increases your interest expense. Well, guess what? You have to print more euros in this case to pay for it. And that leads to more inflation. But even worse than all of that, Europe's economy is not doing great. Their energy costs are very high. Their labor costs are high. They live in many ways a very comfortable life with a gigantic social safety network, 35-hour work weeks, months of vacation at a time. It's very appealing, but the problem is when you have a lot of people not producing, you end up with very weak economic growth. And so, again, the prescription for that would be to reduce interest rates. Well, if you do that, you're going to get more inflation. So the EU is really heading for stagflation, and they've gotten themselves stuck where no matter what they do, they have a gigantic problem. And so, here we are. And this is the same thing we've been talking about in Japan for the last 2 years. Japan is facing a very similar problem. And, these are issues that we have here in the United States where we have too much debt, too much inflation, and the Federal Reserve here is reducing interest rates into increasing inflation. The only difference is, Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who we also are certain is not a vampire. But, you know, Powell is smart enough to not say we're lowering interest rates and inflation is going up. Now, is that happening? Yeah, it is, but he was at least smart enough not to say it.
Great stuff in thing number 4, Gary. And as always, really encourage everyone, jump to deepknowledgeinvesting.com before we finish this 5th thing. Sign up for a free subscription, join our free list. You'll be notified of new content. Premium subscribers will be the only ones that have access to premium content, material, current recommendations, buys, and then when position closes as well. Be sure to check that out. And students, one thing to mention, sometimes it's often forget, we also have discount rates for you as well if you're interested in jumping in and grabbing a DKI subscription.